A lot of people have started to pitch microdosing as this new SSRI. How do we really help microdosing become something that's a paradigm changer and not just sort of slotted into the broken system that we already have available to us?
What we've found is pharmaceuticals are symptom specific. They're little arrows shooting at a target. And when they're effective, SSRIs help maybe 50% of the people that use them. It's terrific. The fact that they don't help an awful lot of people suggests that the whole notion that they work in the same part of the brain for everyone begins to fall apart. So there's a category called good for everybody. And that's because it helps the whole organism. And the organism, it's a physical and mental, emotional, spiritual thing. Microdosing improves the functioning of that thing, and that's the paradigm shift.
Hey folks, welcome back to the Psychedelic Podcast. Today we are joined by Dr. James Fadiman, a veteran pioneer in psychedelics, widely recognized as the father of modern microdosing. Jim founded the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, now Sophia University, and has been deeply involved in psychedelic research and advocacy for over 60 years. He also authored the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide before teaming up with Jordan Gruber on their 2020 collaboration, Your Symphony of Selves. Jordan is a writer and longtime collaborator, a former attorney turned writer and editor. He has co-authored works across psychology, spirituality, finance, and personal development. Him and Jim have been friends now for 35 years, since 1990. That's when I was born, which is interesting. And Jordan also contributed to the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide. Jordan co-authored Your Symphony of Selves and also co-authored Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance, which is Jim and Jordan's new book. Touted as the first comprehensive book on microdosing, it blends emerging scientific research, FDA-relevant content, and thousands of real-world reports collected from individuals across 80 countries. Jim and Jordan, it's an honor to have you on the podcast today. Thank you so much for joining.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Paul.
So, Jordan, let's start with you because our listeners are probably familiar with Jim. They've at least heard the episode that we did with Jim many years ago. They know about Jim and the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, but I'd love to hear a little bit about you and your relationship with psychedelics and maybe microdosing in particular. What has you fascinated with this topic of microdosing and broadly psychedelic use?
Well, a lot about it has me fascinated. A lot of the same things that have surprised Jim, just how many different uses it has, from the physical and mental healing to the enhanced performance, and just kind of seeing it grow and burgeon. And I'm also very interested in the cutting edge of where the actual science is, what we know for certain about why it's not a placebo, and we don't need to talk about that anymore, and some of the different reasons that microdosing works across so many things. And, I've just been interested in psychedelics since college when I quit working for Ralph Nader as an intern and thought that human potential had to be the key. Jim told me about microdosing soon after he learned about it, and I undertook a pretty, I was pretty strict with myself in the beginning in terms of the protocol, and I've been microdosing off and on ever since. And it's just been a real opportunity to partner with Jim on two books in a row. It's been amazing.
Yeah, Jim is a living legend. We hope they got to figure out all the longevity stuff as soon as possible. So Jim can be with us for at least another, 40 or 50 years. There is some interesting psychedelic research coming out about longevity. But Jim, I want to hand it over to you, and talk a little bit about why is it that you wrote this book with a frame around healing and enhanced performance in particular? Why is it that you've really looked at this not just from a clinical lens, but from a broader lens about sort of physiological health and performance more broadly?
Well, I'm kind of a backward scientist, an old-fashioned scientist, which is I start with evidence, not theory. And I listen to people talk about their microdosing. And there were people with physical problems that said they felt better. There were people with depression who felt they weren't depressed, kind of nice clinical categories. But like Dr. Seuss says, most people think the alphabet ends at Z. It's not true. And so I began to notice that people who were just fine or superb were also reporting improvements in what mattered to them. So I began to see that we were breaking out of the both the psychedelic God will see you personally and spiritual changes will make your life different, which is what I've devoted decades to. And we were now moving to something which seemed to help a wide range of conditions, and it didn't fit neatly into kind of Western medical categories. Categories, which, by the way, the government has no category for wellness. They have no information, and there are no rules. But most of us actually are more interested in wellness than in where we're breaking down.
Mm. And this comes back to this notion of microdosing as a vitamin rather than a pharmaceutical. And
Nice.
I'm going to intentionally sort of keep this sort of open because on the one hand, a lot of people have started to pitch microdosing as this new SSRI, let's say, right? Like it's obviously better than Prozac and Lexapro. It is a low dose. It's something you do pretty consistently, and it's supposed to help manage low mood or low energy or sort of get you up and out of a rut. You and I, as we've talked about it, and Jordan as well, we've thought about it more as a sort of vitamin, meaning it is not to sort of fix something, but it's really to help us feel our absolute best. I'd love to hear you just kind of both of you sort of talk through that lens. Microdosing as a pharmaceutical, microdosing as a vitamin. Do you think this is just another SSRI, or how do we really help microdosing become something that's a paradigm changer and not just sort of slotted into the broken system that we already have available to us?
Well, the broken system is doing fine without psychedelics because they keep preventing the use of it. So they must be doing something right. What we've found is pharmaceuticals are symptom specific. They're little arrows shooting at a target. And when they're effective, SSRIs help maybe 50% of the people that use them. It's terrific. The fact that they don't help an awful lot of people suggests that the whole notion that they work in the same part of the brain for everyone begins to fall apart. So what happens, and what we have, wonderful Professor Nutt in England said, anything that he reads about or hears about that seems to cure a whole lot of things, he's very suspicious. That's the pharmaceutical mindset. And so I kind of parody that by saying, well, there's nothing that's good for everybody, right? And everybody goes, right. I say, how about sleep? Well, that's kind of good for everybody. How about improving your diet? Well, that's kind of good for everybody. And it goes on and on. What about exercise? Well, it's good for, how about good relationships? Well, it's good. So there's a category called good for everybody. And that's because it helps the whole organism. And the organism is not a physical, mental, emotional, and little stacks. It's a physical and mental, emotional, spiritual thing. Microdosing improves the functioning of that thing. And that's the paradigm shift, which is you have to get out of the paradigm that it doesn't fit in, where it's really struggles, and you put it in the paradigm of things that are generally good for people, and it fits very easily.
And if you look at SSRI specifically, first of all, there's even new research very recently that says the serotonin hypothesis was never right to begin with.
Correct.
But when someone is using an SSRI, they end up getting zombied out. The bad things are less worse. But when they're microdosing, the bad things are less worse, and they also feel happier. So the whole system is raised. And it's also important to realize, though, that we do have some beginning scientific knowledge about the different ways microdosing is able to help so many things. It does affect neuroplasticity. It does affect it's an anti-inflammatory. It probably affects mitochondria. It does seem to bring people back to a sense, a homeostatic sense of who they are or who they were or how they can be happier. All that, we know that it does that. And so when people are feeling better, a lot of things can get better. They can heal, they can perform better. Life gets better.
Well, I'm glad you're bringing it up and that we're bringing this into the conversation because the predominant frame around general psychedelic research, not just microdosing, has been around the clinical indications. So PTSD, treatment-resistant depression, ADHD, they're these sort of mental, psychological illnesses, if you will, or challenges might be a better lens for that rather than illness. And it's as many of us who are sort of deep in the space know, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. So now we're seeing research come out about psilocybin for Parkinson's, We're seeing research come out about the efficacy of psychedelics for pain. We're seeing research come out about the efficacy of psychedelics for autoimmune conditions. And so it seems to be this sort of whole new potential and possibility. And so, the reason a lot of the research has been on high doses is because what my personal opinion is
they're really cool and interesting and exciting, and the people researching them all come from backgrounds in which they've had personal experience.
Right.
It's kind of like, who writes books about Paris? People who spend a lot of time in Paris. You say, well, but how about the suburbs? There's these great little suburbs near Paris. Yeah, never been there. Who cares? So we're really dealing in a shift. Remember, psychedelics in the 60s were not medicalized. They were culture changing. And President Nixon, who didn't like the culture being changed, made them illegal kind of as a fiat with no science. Then they crept back, and what was the safest way to get back? Well, the medical tent was the safest because people genuinely, for lots of good reasons, respect medicine. The fact that psychedelics are predominantly high doses, almost all used for medical conditions. That's arbitrary. They could be used with athletes. They could also be used with people with autism. And by the way, all of these breakthroughs that you're talking about, all of which is very recent research, are covered in the book, which we finished like a year and a half ago. We have all that's already out there if you look at actual results. And actual results drive research, not the other way around. Researchers don't just say, well, I think I'm going to use this on something or other. What else? What hurts? Let's try that. No, they say, wait a moment. My brother-in-law, who lives in Colombia, has been telling me that he's working with ayahuasca and that his chronic neuropathy is better. Let me look at that. I'd never considered the possibility. Okay, yeah, let's do some research. In fact, I'm in an institute called the Pain Research Institute. We're set up for it. We have grants for kind of wilder research. We can begin to move into that area. So science is, curiously, always second to real experience, not the other way around.
So 2 important points I want to make. I tend to step out and reframe larger, more theoretically, and Jim will give you specific stories and uses. But one point is that it's been very useful for us to realize that most of the way people have used psychedelics since they became popular in the West, in let's say the 40s, amounts to a kind of overdose compared to the broad swath of benefits given by microdosing psychedelics for physical and mental health conditions and enhanced performance. So this is the real helpful dose, and this is similar probably most of the time to what indigenous people were using in their day-to-day lives, not when they were having the big visionary trips. So that's important. And the other important thing is that the reward to risk ratio is really high for microdosing. If you try it and it doesn't work, there are some very minor ways that it might be unpleasant for some people, but it never has become unsafe and it's never a danger. And so much can be done for so many, and the risks are really incredibly minimal. And compare that to pharmaceuticals, where you get stuck having to take them and can't stop taking them without terrible side effects.
Well, and Jim, something you said back in 2017 at the MAPS conference was you are much more interested in the search than the research, which has always stuck with me, that you really want to be sort of out with a machete, kind of charting the path and exploring what's actually work on the ground, rather than, doing all of the follow-up and all the admin and all the structure. And so the work that you've done has inspired a lot of clinical trials now on microdosing, which I think is...
We're very happy to see that. Some of them, like in any other scientific area, some of them are really finely understood research, usually like everything out of New Zealand, not by chance. Other people simply are applying the same old, either pre-psychedelic or high-dose notions. So there's some research on microdosing which wants to test for changes in spiritual belief. Okay, and the answer is there isn't any. Because it's too low a dose. It doesn't approach that. But they're used to that. So the science people are beginning to get it. and the research is improving. And they're also beginning to get, just as you said, for Parkinson's and so forth, they're beginning to get that you're not limited to mental illness. And that's a real breakthrough in the science side.
But you were surprised by all the physical applications early on, weren't you?
Oh, I'm still surprised. I mean, when we get someone who transforms he had a spine so curved that physicians regularly looked at his research and looked at his back and said, "How is it that you're even walking?"
Wow.
And the reason, and he was in terrible pain, and he'd been in terrible pain for decades. So he started microdosing, not using any of our well-established, everybody understands them protocols, just on his own. And he stopped having pain.
Wow. And
then he said, I'm tired of telling people I've stopped having pain. I want to show them. So he sent us a picture. He's a guy in his mid-60s. He said, I got in a little better shape. And we have a picture of him standing on the top of a 14,000-foot mountain. Exactly. I love that. I wish I had a picture of you with your eyeballs out.
And this was a guy who had like 40-something major operations throughout his life. He's like broken everything you could. And he figured out his own protocol that we'd never heard from, and it worked.
Wow. It kind of reminds me of the Dispenza story a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And I just talked with a lawyer yesterday who's helping a lot of these companies that are now getting banned by Meta to get unbanned. And she said, psychedelics saved my life. I mean, I don't think it was just microdosing, but she had a terrible accident, was potentially going to be paralyzed, ended up doing psychedelic therapy, and it helped to heal her physical ailments as well, which I think is...
Well, if she can heal Meta, then she's a real miracle physician. The problem is, as many of these sites have been pushed on and off Meta, and since it's an algorithm, it's something invisible. There's nobody to complain to, and nobody knows why. So what happens is you get high enough up in Meta, and someone says what she says. She says, "Well, gee, I use psychedelics, and it's really been helpful. We've been taking those off. Let's put it back on."
Right. Let's talk a little bit about microdosing versus psycholytic dosing. Torsten Passy, who I know is a friend and collaborator of you both, wrote a book many years ago called The Science of Microdosing Psychedelics, in which he talked a lot about the psycholytic research that was done, I believe, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, largely in Switzerland and Germany. However, psycholytic dosing is distinct from microdosing.
Absolutely.
And I'd love if you could talk a little bit about that nuance, and maybe as part of that, how is it that we're now defining microdosing? I know early on it was subperceptual. I've heard Paul Stamets talk about it as subintoxicating. I've heard sort of subthreshold also as part of the conversation. So if you could provide some color on that in terms of where you've
landed. The reason that we use subperceptual is a word I invented early on because I didn't want to say subhallucinogenic, which sounds awful. It was too strong. What really, we now call it subthreshold, meaning the threshold, you're below the threshold where there are any classic psychedelic effects, period.
So no visuals, no thought ideations, no having any qualms about having your ordinary day. For me, if I was above a microdose, I wouldn't want to give my cat his insulin shots. I just didn't like that if I was actually microdosing. So, I mean, I don't know what the standard dosage range for psycholytic. I'm guessing it's like 40 to 80
something
of micrograms of LSD. So, I mean, what we have found overall is that for most people, given that people are very bio-individual and some people need more and some people need less, the general rule of thumb still sticks. It's 1/10 to 1/20th of a full recreational dose. So for LSD, that's 5 to 10 micrograms, generally speaking.
And we now have thousands of people who can do whatever they want come to use those doses. And their reports is what pretty much our book is full of. So this isn't from on high. This is from people helping people. Now, I should mention I am involved in Torsten's book. So I want to make it clear that he asked me to look it over, and I changed most of the ends of chapters where he would say, but it doesn't look like there's any real evidence. And I would change that to, here is the evidence we have so far. And most of the book is, as you pointed out, psycholytic, which was very popular in Europe and has never been popular here. It's kind of therapeutic, and it doesn't then it has no bells, whistles, and divine choirs welcoming you. So it kind of doesn't have the advantages of microdosing, which is safe and you don't need any support staff, etc. And it isn't high dose where we know of the very large transformational changes. And the reason why did microdosing not appear in Europe? I love this because we're talking mainly LSD. And if you ordered LSD from Sandoz, which you could do for years by just writing them basically with any kind of stationery that had you went to graduate school at the end of your name, you got little ampules, glass ampules with 25 micrograms. That was the smallest they sent you.
So what's important here is to realize that if you go outside of what we're now calling the peak efficacy zone, or the PEZ, which is really just the sweet spot, it's not going to work as well. And if you go below it, it's not going to work as well, though some people go very low. And a really good example of this is this March 2025 paper on 20 micrograms of LSD for ADHD, which in the paper itself, they refer to as a low dose almost every time, or a very high microdose. But yet every news organ picked it up as microdosing doesn't work for ADHD. In fact, they didn't test microdosing at all, and they have no idea. It was just, and the reason they did this, and this shows that tendency for the old science to come back, is they said, we thought if we doubled the dose, and they even state the rule of thumb, the 1/10 to 1/20. The reason they doubled the dose, they said, was so that it would be easier to observe the results. So this shows that they don't understand that it has a sweet spot. And we've been saying this all along in all of the anecdotal reports. Lots of people say, if you take too much, you lose focus. You can't do stuff. It's not going to work.
Well, again, if we look at only real world is kind of the end spot for most research. With psychedelics, it's the beginning spot. We just got a wonderful report of people in Argentina surveying psychedelic use, they're comparing microdose use, and a little chart that says, what did you choose to take? How much did you choose to take? And it's a little bell curve, just around about 3 milligrams of a mushroom, which is in that same range. Nobody took this high dose that Jordan referred to. That's what people are doing worldwide. So when I say there's some science which simply didn't know enough about microdosing to set it up correctly, and then it's a gorgeous experiment from there. So it's easy to kind of think, well, maybe because everything else was right. And I, a science reporter, I don't really know how much a microdose is, so I'll believe them. So anyway, that's a kind of, as you can see, we're the reason we're sorry about that piece of research is the news said it doesn't help ADHD. In our book, it's a major area where we have so many reports of people able for the first time since maybe they were children to stop taking ADHD medication. And for those of you who don't know what ADHD medication is, it's various forms of amphetamine, period. And it's obviously it's addicting. It has side effects.
Oh yeah.
And at least if you're in the United States, it's extraordinarily expensive.
And about this idea that psychedelic leadership, prominent members, people whose names everybody knows, almost reflexively spit out, "Well, we're not sure if it's just a placebo." If you look at Connor Murray's papers from 2021, 2022, and 2024, he has both a psychological instrument and brainwaves, hard brainwave science, in a placebo-controlled it was triple-blind study, as he put it, which unequivocally shows that there's a sweet spot. There were certain positive mental benefits that didn't happen at the higher dose he was testing, but happened at the lower dose. So we know, we have this science, and all you have to do is talk to all the people who have, microdosed.
So anyway, you can see that we're fond of science, but I was trying to get what the problem is. And the problem with science is that when it's guessing, it doesn't say that. So that there's a kind of arrogance. And the serotonin hypothesis, and that was for the last 40 years with SSRIs, it was never called serotonin, it was serotonin hypothesis. Now we know that hypothesis is not true. That doesn't mean that SSRIs have changed how they work, but the science guessed wrong and then bet the house on it. So we don't do that kind of science. We really are limiting ourselves to things where human beings have had reputable and clear and efficacious results and report those results in a way in which they're anonymous so they never get credit, and other people then test it the same way.
And using real world evidence from citizen scientists like this has been the tradition in the West since the founding of the Royal Academy in the late 1600s. It's on nobody's authority, but you have to speak to people, and then you get what Ken Wilber called I forgot what it's called. I lost it.
Homeostatic something.
Yeah, no, an intersubjective hermeneutical verification. It's like you have a panel of Zen masters, and somebody comes in, and they can tell right away how far advanced they are in Zen. If you have a lot of people talk about what they've experienced and what the dose range is and what to do, and the knowledge kind of comes to a point where you go, oh, this is what we've condensed as good working knowledge for most people. This is where people should start, and we've got that now.
It's in a way the start of a lineage. That's to use another metaphor, kind of like martial arts or something like that.
When people are knowledgeable and share, I'm just thinking of a group where you don't say to people, what's the science behind this? It's called cooking. Now, there's a lot of science behind it, and it's fascinating and fun, but chefs help chefs, because the real world evidence is not in the ratio of carbohydrates to sugar, to salt. It's, did it taste correctly for the last possible tasters, which are the other chefs? And that's a science, but it's not, quote, analytic. It's not heavy on numbers. It's not using statistics, but it's well understood, and it's worldwide, and it's done through sharing and caring and helping other people achieve the same results that you've had. And we really are more in that model probably than any other scientific model.
Well, and it also feels like it's art versus technique. So there's a refinement of the approach that is more artistic, that requires attunement, that requires listening, that requires experimentation. And I think the challenge with modern science is it's become ossified to focus only on technique because of our sort of obsession with machines, if you will. And so I think we also have to remember the humanity of this sort of work is, as you said, in community, there is the possibility for the refinement of how we approach this, which leads into my next question on protocols. And we've been kind of hinting around it. But when you came out with the Psychedelic Explorer's Guide in 2011,
right,
it was the 1 day on, 2 days off protocol, do it for 10 cycles, I think, in total was the recommendation. And since then, Paul Stamets has come out with his. Initially, it was 5 days on, 2 days off, then 4 days on, 3 days off. There are some people who advise an every other day. I know some practitioners in our community, they're utilizing microdoses of LSD for ADHD. It's a 5 day on, 2 day off protocol that they're using for that, which is quite useful. So I'd just be generally curious to hear both your thoughts on how have your perspectives around protocols evolved in the last 15 years.
Truth. I developed the first protocol, which is really it's a high class word for schedule. Okay.
Yeah.
Which was taking it day one, not taking it day two, not taking it day three. That has become the most popular. That was never its intention. I was trying to find out what happened to people.
Right.
And so people would microdose and they would tell me what happened. And then the next day I'd say, please don't microdose, because I wanted them to come down so I could then have them come up again and learn some more. But they kept saying the second day is just as good. That was our first discovery. Now, we now have, and I can give you some pseudoscientific discussion of why the second day also works, but the fact is it works. So now I said, okay, don't take it the third day, because I really want you to come down to base so I can get more information. Rather than if someone takes it, for a whole month, I only get one real reading. But if they take it, I get 9 readings. Okay, so that was its total purpose. It was research generated, and people liked it. And after about 9 or 10 cycles, people would say, honestly, all the 3 days are beginning to look alike, because what we were seeing is the cumulative, the basic shifting in the health of the organism. So now it's also, fortunately, it's an easier way for some people to say it's not like a pharmaceutical.
You have to take it every day.
Where you not only have to take it every day, but if you ever read that little foldy thing that you get with your pharmaceutical, which I do not recommend reading because it'll terrify you, it says if you miss a day, and then all of a sudden there's something in bold, which tells you to get back on it as soon as possible, or you'll have something terrible happen. Microdosing is the opposite. So protocol schedules arose, and my theory, and I've asked Paul. I said my theory, Paul, is the reason you have 4.2 and 4.3 and 5.2 is you have access to a lot more mushrooms than most people. There was no real reply, but I did check the difference between 4.3 and 5.2, and he said you can't be too rigid because people search out what works best for them.
My perspective is that the main theme of microdosing is that less is enough, or that less is more.
Mm-hmm.
If you do the Stamets 5.2, you would dose 23 times in a 31-day month.
Mm-hmm.
With the 4.3, it's 19 times. With
Mm-hmm.
Fadiman, it's 11 times. I think you're a lot better off having time to experience the second day and having your brain and nervous system learn to adapt and use it and to really take advantage of it. Jim came up with the analogy of a potter's wheel. You know, like you kick it one day and then you spend the time kind of shaping it, and then after a few days you kick it again and you shape it. I think that there's a lot more value to people and that they can learn to, integrate and figure out what are they going to rewire with that neuroplasticity that's available to them. And it's just a lot gentler and easier. And in the end, most people switch to an intuitive protocol. They either do it every other day, or somebody was telling me today they do it Monday, Wednesday, Fridays because it's easy for them to remember. And, everybody kind of shifts. But I think to guarantee the most likelihood of success, you want to start with the most conservative protocol. And that's the one that Jim came up with.
Yeah, start low and go slow. You can always, what I tell folks is you can always do it more often, or you can always take more, but best to really start at a low dose. I do think a counterpoint or another topic to add to the conversation is, unfortunately, a lot of people are very, we'll just say sick, and that could be with depression, or it could be addiction, or it could be PTSD. And so, I know in my early days of doing a lot of acid when I was 19, the first couple years that I found out about LSD, I was like, let's do this once a month. And this wasn't a microdose, this was higher doses. And then after those 2 years, I was like, oh, I get it. So I'm going to sort of taper it off now and do these high doses less often. And so I think one of the potential upsides of maybe front loading on a protocol is people really feel it and they really notice it. One of the trade-offs, though, is, again, they may also become sort of psychologically reliant on it. And so this goes into my next question about sort of breaks and tolerance buildup. For a lot of supplements, as an example, they often recommend, okay, take this for 8 weeks and then take 4 weeks off. Or for peptides, which are becoming more prevalent, do this for 6 weeks and then take 3 weeks off. What's your sort of lens on that when it comes to microdosing? Is this something that someone could potentially do for the rest of their life? Is it, best to only do maybe a couple protocols and sort of see where they're at before they commit to doing it more often? How do you sort of look at tolerance and safety and things like
closer
that?
to the supplement peptide model, and I'm delighted to know that because most pharmaceuticals, which are unnatural, the manufacturing and marketing, if they get it right, you take it forever.
Right.
Period. So we're back down to the real world. And what happened spontaneously, I told you kind of the story of the 3-day protocol, which had nothing to do with medical, What we found over the next few years, this is reports from independent groups around the world who were experimenting, as your groups do. And they all came up with the notion that it seemed right after 3 or 4 weeks to take time off. Now, that's really not in the pharmaceutical world. I'm glad to hear it's in the peptide world and so forth. That emerged. And since it emerged, that's the way we work. We recommend it to people to look at what everyone else has already come up with that they said helped them. It's very hard to do a good science. It doesn't fit the Western science model. The on-off. It's very hard to measure because if people are continuing to improve, which is what our data says, then the difference between taking it all the time and having days off may not be measurable. So we continue to recommend what people tell us works for them. And we have two groups of people who basically have it for a condition, let's say depression.
Mm-hmm.
And they're, quote, treatment resistant, which means the contemporary treatments didn't work. It's not their fault. And they say after several weeks, and this is the term we hear most, I'm back.
Mm.
They say, well, I said, what do you mean? I feel the way I did before I became depressed. Then they take a couple of weeks off. A number of them say, well, I'm done with depression. I don't know what it was, but I'm not depressed. And they go on with their lives. And they may use microdosing for something else later. Other people say, and this is depression where we have probably the most cases, after a few weeks, I can feel the depression coming back.
Mm.
And in all the high dose studies, they don't say people are overcured. They just say people don't need medication for X amount of time as they measure.
3 months or 6 months or whatever.
Depending on the study and depending if they have bothered to measure. So, and I was working with someone one night who said, I have two groups of friends because I've turned on so many people after my depression was lifted. And one group stops and the other group returns. And I said, I thought that is a terrific research. Okay, wow. And I said, well, since I didn't know anything, I said, what do you think is the difference? Since she was asking me what the difference was, I do what science do, is you pretend and turn it back. And after we talked for a while, she said, because she knew all these people, she said, the people who stopped, their lives are pretty well working. And the people who went back, their lives weren't working very well. They're still not working. Meaning they're out of work. They've lost their apartment. Their cat's dying. They have things that would tip them back towards their depression. So that's as far as I can tell you. And the thing that fascinated me is the independent creation of time off from groups that had pretty much nothing much else in common.
Anything to add, Jordan, to that?
As someone who's mainly using it for enhancement purposes,
Mm-hmm.
I do find it a little hard sometimes to take breaks as long as the recommended breaks should be. And I know that. We have a friend, Billy, who's always teasing me about that. And I wonder about that. I know I'm going a little bit against it, but I think that, when we think about some of the sports people, like we know long distance runners,
Mm-hmm.
ultra marathoners, they're really enjoying microdosing and martial artists. And I'm wondering if those guys are also taking long breaks or not. So, I'm sort of aware of it. And then, there are some of the kind of the scary risks that there's no proof for that people float out there, and it sits in the back of my mind. And then, when it's actually, the every other day thing, I'm usually like, I'm ready again. So I don't know. I mean, I don't feel any tolerance build up.
Well, I found in my own practice, because I've been doing this for 10 years myself, it seems to be about a 3 weeks on, 1 week off kind of flow, as Jim said, 3 to 4 weeks. And naturally, maybe I'll travel and I just don't want to bring LSD with me on the airplane. Or maybe I'm, just so involved with something, I just don't think about it as much, and I'm not doing it as often. But I find generally for every 3 weeks I'm microdosing, I take a week off, and then every so often I may take a month or 2 months or 3 months off. It could be because I'm traveling. It could be, a couple of years ago I did a dieta in the jungle with ayahuasca, so there were no other substances as part of that dieta. I did a Vipassana a couple of years ago, so for that length of time, there was no microdosing. So it seems to be these natural things fall into place. And for me, it's not because anything is wrong, but I just genuinely enjoy LSD. Like, I just really love it. And it just seems to help me have that little extra spark, and I haven't yet seen any research that suggests it's potentially harmful if taken over the long term. I mean, we're familiar with the sort of 5-HT2B, heart valve agonism, but again, there's been absolutely no clinical research around that, and the dosage that we're taking is so low for LSD.
I corresponded with one of those people that says, "Oh, you got to watch out for your heart," and I wrote back and I said, "What's your data?" And he sent me this great study, which it turns out if you take MDMA at a higher dose than suggested daily for weeks, it can cause a heart valve damage. And I said, well, How about psychedelics and how about microdosing? He said, well, we don't really have any evidence. And then he said, since he was really hot on that it was must cause problems, he said, however, if you're taking days off and times off, I can't think of how it could possibly damage your heart. So that's from one of the people who likes to publish that it damages your heart.
We actually ran into one of those people at one of the talks we gave at a conference, and they really were like, they wanted us to understand they had a model that showed that there could really be a problem. And the problem with this is that
there's no evidence.
Via the nocebo effect, they could be causing more stress and problems with people than anything that would be actually cause of the heart.
Yeah, I just
so far
it's very flimsy.
When you're in the real world, you say, if I say no evidence, that usually ends the discussion. In the science world, you're still allowed to theorize anything you want. It's possible. And of course, it's also possible that you're going to grow wings, but it's rare.
Don't kill my hopes, Jim. So let's talk about the Center for Mind, which is a new nonprofit from
Bruce Danner.
Bruce Dahmer, yeah. the former NASA scientist who's exploring this overlap of psychedelics and creativity. And they often, and Jim, this is right up your wheelhouse, especially because of the research that you did in the 60s on LSD and mescaline for creativity and problem solving. The Center for Mind suggests that microdosing often helps to ease cognitive friction rather than enhance raw creativity. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about what is that distinction or difference, and how do you think about this overlap even of microdosing, flow states, and sort of creativity at large?
Well, again, I have to admit that at MAPS recently, Bruce presented his basic kind of model for minds, and I introduced the panel because he said he had developed the entire model based on the effectiveness of our research in the 60s on creativity. So I have a stake in minds, and I like that. I love the notion of cognitive friction. I haven't the faintest idea what it is, but I kind of like the image. Okay, it's like thoughts grinding against each other and little flecks of thoughts kind of falling off. But I bet that isn't what he has in mind. I think he's talking about thoughts interrupt each other, and the creativity is more of a flow. But that's a guess. My feeling is it's wonderful that there's a whole new way of doing research on creativity, which may be useful. Now, notice the beginning is called the research. The useful is at the end. So I'm a supporter. I have been asked to meet with their team, probably more because I'm a relic than I'm very helpful. But since one of the major uses of psychedelics among the quote healthy is increased flow state, which is the simple way of saying you're in the best state you can be to be creative, and you can stay in it longer with microdosing. And I'm still remembering a young man at a gathering who stood up and said, I only microdose when I have a coding problem. So that's creativity. So we don't know anything.
So my explanation is a little bit different, Paul. And it goes back to your symphony of selves and the idea of healthy multiplicity, and that we have different selves. We know that when you take psychedelics, whether microdosing or macrodosing, that there's more entropy in the brain, or we could put it as the default mode network is toned down, or that different parts of the brain are able to connect more freely, and you're able to get out of the way you normally are. My belief is that you can move into the part of you that is really good at getting into flow states and being most creative. You can steer the ship of self into being in the part of you. For example, when I write, when I'm doing professional writing stuff, that part of me, before it sits down, has to be fed and watered and exercised. And then I can be in the part of me that can do long hours of focus and make my clients happy. But I have to get into that part. And I think that a lot of this is for the scientific creative process true as well. And, for all we know, they might have had even better results in the 60s if they'd used a lower dose. Who knows?
I think Jordan, what Jordan is saying is, let's change our paradigm. Okay, we've talked about the paradigm of pharmaceuticals, and it doesn't fit microdosing.
Mm.
We also have an even stronger paradigm, which is this thing inside me called the self is unified, and there's only one of it. Now, why does it have it? Therefore, this following would be impossible with that model. Do you ever argue with yourself? Yes. Who is the other person arguing? Well, if I'm a unified self, there isn't anybody. But since I do argue with myself, maybe the model needs to be improved, which is what we did with our book. And I'm really now seeing that I want to make sure Jordan talks to the minds people, because since they haven't started their research, they're actually open to doing the best research possible. Once they get going, one of the terrible things about a research project is if you're halfway through and you kind of realize it isn't working, it's very, very, very hard to stop because you haven't even disproved what you came up to, to do. Um, so we've seen projects that go on after long after they should have been shot.
Yeah, there is something here about harmony, right? Coming back to what we were talking about at the outset, and you've mentioned this plenty of times before, Jim, the sense that microdosing, and I would say even general psychedelic use, creates harmony within a system. And when an organism is more harmonious, it's much easier to create. I remember a couple months ago, I watched this great movie, Maestro, which is about the story of Leonard Bernstein, the great American composer and conductor. And there's this scene where he's talking to his wife, and his wife is like basically saying, if summer can't sing in you, then hope is lost. You have to allow the summer to sing through you and be part of you. And there seems to be something that psychedelics and microdosing do that allow us to feel this sort of vitality of expression, even, and that vitality is it's often this sort of love for existence, and I would even say a love for creation, because fundamentally that's really what we are as humans, is we are creators. So and getting back to that self energy is essential in that process.
Jordan, when I start mentioning in further talks harmony, remind me to thank Paul on the air. Okay.
All right.
Because what we're seeing, I mean, the nice thing about harmony is not a single thing.
Right.
And if inner harmony, which if you say that to people, everybody says, "Oh yeah, that's really nice." There's an implicit understanding of their own differentiation, which is what our book kind of makes very, very clear. Once you start thinking in terms of inner harmony, then you're able to shift towards what is most important. If you watch a conductor, he doesn't wave that little stick at everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
He's listening, and when some group is not in the harmony, he says, a little more violins, a little less bass. And because the harmony is all the parts. And when all the parts are working, it's superior to any individual part.
One more quick idea on the creativity that just came up for me. Joseph Chilton Pierce, who you may know of, used to talk. He wrote The Crack in the Cosmic Egg and a book on children. Talk about how our minds are really just transceivers. We don't, even our memories aren't really resident within us. And that when you're microdosing, your transceiver seems to have a broader range of stations that it can tune into, or maybe better fidelity.
This also goes back, Jim had talked about this metaphor years ago. I haven't heard him talk about it, but sort of the AM and the FM radio signal, how high doses of psychedelics are more like FM and microdoses are more like AM. And I do think they allow you to tune into a greater fidelity. It almost feels like at higher doses, it can sometimes be difficult to discern between what's the mushrooms or what's the ayahuasca and what's actually me. And I think the opportunity with these lower doses, especially, this is why I love LSD, because LSD doesn't really have that agenda like mushrooms.
It's a non-specific amplifier is the language we like now.
Right. And I almost see it as like love in crystal form that we're bringing into our body.
I mean, one of the things, when particularly ayahuasca, everybody says, ayahuasca said this to me, and ayahuasca is this, and ayahuasca is like a grandmother, and ayahuasca nobody says that about LSD. nobody personified. There's no Mr. LSD or the great Virgin LSD. Um, but we know that they're both are working parts of the large parts of the brain in a similar way. So um, again, what science tends to do, if it can't measure it, it tends to say maybe it doesn't exist.
Mm.
Because if it doesn't exist, then I'm free, I'm clear. So if you say to a scientist, well, what do you think about the spirit of ayahuasca? They say, well, we have no evidence for that. You can't measure it. You think, yes, you can. You use this device, which has been it's taken a lot of time to build this device to be so sensitive, and to throw away something because you can't put it into a statistical table. That's the fault of the table.
Right.
And that's also why the power of story. There's so many stories in our book. And when you read the stories, when you read, for example, Michela de la Maico's Mothers of the Mushroom survey results, which we are fortunate to publish 10 pages of, when you read how many of these women were absolutely thrilled and it was world changing and they could relate to their husbands or their partners or better latching mechanics, and they felt reconnected with themselves and got through postpartum depression so much faster than the first time. So even though a couple of them have a little bit of nausea or anxiety about their legal situation, the overwhelming positive reaction of people who have microdosed or taken higher doses of psilocybin for parenting and pregnancy and breastfeeding, it's so clear, even though that's something that's never been tested and maybe never will be tested because of our fear of doing damage to the pregnant mother and baby.
And the legal policy is an interesting one, right? And it's a topic that I want to briefly touch on. In 2023, 8 million people took psilocybin mushrooms in the United States. 47% of those took a microdose the last time that they had taken mushrooms. And yet all of the legal policy that's been developed so far between Oregon and Colorado, we're now looking at New Mexico, we're looking, I think the Czech Republic just legalized psilocybin for medical use, really focuses on high doses in clinical service centers. And yet we know that the vast majority of people who are coming into this work are looking at lower doses. And because there's no legal regulated framework, they're all over the place. I mean, I could share 50 websites where you can just go buy microdoses. So I'd be curious to hear from both of you. How do you think about sort of regulatory policy when it relates to microdosing? How do you think about sort of the legal landscape as it relates to microdosing? If you could sort of wave a wand and create a structure or a system that would help people get this access to this legally, what would you do?
Let me just say two things quickly, and then we'll turn it to Jim. Before I complain that the leaders of the psychedelics movement worldwide keep saying, well, you don't know if it's all placebo or not, they also are really stuck on the idea that for certain kinds of serious situations, like treatment-resistant depression, it has to be high doses with a therapist. Now, there's a test going on in Canada right now, an at-home LSD depression test that might put this to bed, but we've got a lot of stories about people's treatment-resistant depression going away. You don't have to have big reveals with, and huge breakthroughs in order to get better. And so they're, and the obvious reason they're into that is because they've spent, decades now trying to get that approved. So that's what they want to have happen. And there's a lot of money and prestige involved that we're going, you might not need, some people will of course benefit more from that and will need that, but a lot of people don't need that level.
Right. One of the nice things about alternative medicine, if you go to a chiropractor and he does that, and your neck pain for the last 4 months, and all of the steroids you have at home and all your medication, you feel better. It's a different method. The problem for the legal structure, and that is a problem, is everyone ignores that microdosing is around. So we're getting on, and no, it isn't totally true. In Oregon, someone said, hey, how about microdosing? As I actually testified at some point in Oregon.
Oh, yeah.
So they said, well, if you go down and you get a microdose, you don't have to stay there 4 hours. How about 30 minutes? And I say, well, gee, that's like if you went to the gas station and after they fill your tank, they say, well, you can't go away for 30 minutes because what if the gas evaporates and the car blows up and you're away? And the answer is, that's a very silly thing you just said. You don't know anything about cars or gas tanks. So I have actually been pushing through my best ways to get the people in Washington who are eager to make psychedelics way more available to not forget microdosing
Hmm.
or to totally forget microdosing.
So the problem is that the less is enough idea, just it's so against what we believe in the West. It has to be bigger, it has to be more in order for it to be good and great. And so this is a whole different approach to this natural substance and analogs of them that really work at these very low doses that, don't make you crazy, even temporarily.
Well, I think a lot of the narrative from the sort of vanguard of this psychedelic renaissance has been, oh, we can't do that with microdosing because, well, then everyone's just gonna have access to it and they can do drugs whenever they want, and
Right.
like the horror
Right.
without.
And, have you ever told them about aspirin? Most people have in there enough to kill themselves with aspirin right in there. Why don't they do that? Well, because that isn't the way it's worked out. So the legal world is its own adventure. And we also know that the lobbyists aren't sure what they want yet about microdosing. What microdosing has escaped is the whole capitalist twist.
Right.
There's almost no companies that are testing microdosing in order to have a product that they can sell for 100 times what it costs to make.
There are many that are now selling products, chocolate bars or gummies.
But that's not within the legal market.
Correct. Right. Correct.
Except in Oregon, or except in Colorado, or except in Europe, or except in Jamaica, or except in
Brazil, maybe, I think is starting to look at it.
So reality is creeping in. The legal system is the slowest. And there's good reasons for that. But the medical system is slow in a different way, where it says if we don't have enough information and we don't want to put any money into researching and getting enough information, our fallback position is don't do it. Now, during the era when spices became available in Europe and the Spice Islands were like the most valuable real estate in the world, had science been there, they would have just said, well, that's all those people in those islands, who do we know about them? And we know these are very strong tastes, so let's not try it. And what we know about people who want to get better, they'll try things. And we'd rather they try something that's as safe and as inexpensive as possible.
Right.
And that they can even grow their own now. It's pretty easy compared to how it used to be to grow your own mushrooms.
Super easy. I mean, most folks can't yet synthesize their own acid, but maybe we'll get there at some point. Yeah, it is a bigger
kit.
That
breakthrough with the morning glory seeds, that may change. We'll see.
There we go. Yeah, with LSA. Yeah, we could see. So kind of the final question that I have for both of you is, the new book, Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance, has citizen science reports from across, I think it says 81 countries. And I'm curious for both of you individually, what is like a standout story or anecdote that you read about that was shared with you that just, has just left an imprint on you in terms of what microdosing can do?
Well, first of all, we have found for most questions, we can say it's in the book. I just got a request from Peru. People were interested in autism, and the Spanish language edition will be coming out in a few months. But
great.
But here's a story that isn't in the book. Okay, this is a guy whose son has been kind of strange as a child. He was asocial. He's kind of weird. He's doesn't do well with other people, and he drops out of school with the school's total support as a high school junior. Over the summer, for various reasons, his parents suggest microdosing, and he says he'll try it. So over the summer break, he starts microdosing, and within a couple of weeks, his attitude changes. He's nicer to be around. He helps around the house. He's like a member of the family instead of somebody who's a little crazy. And he says to his father, I want to take advanced placement courses. Remember, this is a dropout.
Wow.
So his father takes him to school, and the kid asks his teachers, can I take the AP version of this class? All of them say no, except his math teacher. And his math teacher says, you understand, you have to do 189% of the curriculum that I'm teaching for you to be able to get what you're after. The kid says, terrific. End of school, exams, they're both school and national. He passes math.
Wow.
He passes math highest in the class. He passes math higher than anyone in the school has ever scored.
Wow.
And he gets A's in every other class. That's why we do what we do. Because he read about us, his father read about us somewhere and thought maybe this would help. And then his wife knew something about mushrooms. And it's really a beautiful story. But here is this person whose life has been totally transformed. It isn't like he's got 18% more cognitive flexibility during ingestion. We're talking real world, real life change. And I'm just thrilled. And I've already written the father and said, please keep us, on track. And the father said, mushrooms didn't make him smart. I already knew he was smart. But what they did was, and we're now talking high functioning autism, Asperger's. They allowed him to be competent with other people, and with his own feelings. So that's what we're doing. That's my story.
And this is a good time to point out that we do have a website. It's microdosingbook.com, one word, microdosing book. And in that website, we invite citizen scientists to submit reports or questions or comments.
This is how we got this wonderful family.
So my story is one that actually is in the book. And again, it's about autism, but this time it's low functioning autism. A father wrote in to Jim and said, I've got this son he's banging his head against the floor. He's in terrible shape. It's low end of autism. And Jim said, of course, well, I can't advise you to do anything like that with your son. Well, the father went ahead anyway, and the kid started getting much better. And now a few years later, this kid is having a dose once every 30 days, a microdose once every 30 days to reset his language abilities and his social functioning. And it's working really well. So, this point about, the U.S. government says it's absolutely fine for a child to have Ritalin if they're at least 3 years old. So there's tens of thousands of kids, tens of thousands in the United States on Ritalin. Why not start with something instead that has such a high reward to risk ratio instead of giving this pharmaceutical that does God knows what and, is almost impossible to come off of easily?
Right. Why not use something that we've been using potentially for thousands of years, if not longer, and that we've co-evolved with in many ways. And autism is becoming more widespread, and there's various sort of both hypotheses and conspiracy theories as to why autism is becoming more widespread. But the fundamental truth is this is a big challenge, especially for parents or younger kids. And so the fact that even at very low doses, it can be useful for folks who may be on there.
Especially in low doses. Okay.
Right.
This is if you don't say to your 4-year-old, I'm going to give you, an overwhelming dose of LSD. You're going to see God. You're going to realize that you were both never born and will never die. And the kid looks at you and says, Daddy, can I have a little less?
About? Yeah.
And also, let me just say that if you do have a more harmonious symphony of selves that's more cohesive, you're less likely to get pulled into the self that is hyper distractible. You're more likely to notice that you've been done that. I mean, for me, ADHD and all this has happened because there's so much stimuli. I mean, 30 years ago, no one had a phone. Now people are spending 2 to 8 hours a day on it. I mean, it's so shifted. So having access to the different parts of who you are, the different cells, and knowing when you have to shift into the part that, can't goof around and has to do what it has to do, I think that's very valuable.
I love that. Well, microdosingbook.com. If folks have stories that they'd like to submit, if you'd like to purchase the book, you can find it from there. You can also go to Amazon. Jim, Jordan, it's really been an honor to have this conversation with you today. Jim, I just want to honor you for all the work you've done over these last 50 years and setting off. I know this wasn't intentional, but a microdosing revolution in many ways as a as a mischievous, the mischievous troublemaker that you are.
It's either that or a regular job.
Right. And Jordan, for all of your incredible craftsmanship and wordsmithing and being able to collaborate with Jim and help write, I mean, not just this book, but Symphony of Selves is also a fantastic finished product. So I just want to thank you both for all the work that you have done and you continue to do in the microdosing space. It really has been invaluable to, I know, millions and millions of people. And it's really been an honor to sit down with you today and hear about the new book.
Yeah,
well, thank you very much. And although you may not have mentioned it, Paul has a couple of microdosing books out on Amazon. They're less, nobody can, in a sense, is as comprehensive as us, not because we're terrific, but because we have been collecting from and asking for 10 years.
And we're terrific.
That too.
But there are other books out there, and take a look.
More to come. All right. Thank you so much, Paul. This was great. It's great to talk to someone who's so enthusiastic and well-informed and is thinking a lot of the same thoughts we're thinking.
Always. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. The psychedelic space is evolving every day, and we have a ton of amazing content that's coming out, and subscribing is the best way to keep up to date with all of that great content.